for the Education Authority and also for schools and all our teachers. I know educational professionals have been working extremely hard to deliver in these completely unprecedented and unanticipated crises. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. How much do we know as Hackney Learning Trust about the level of provision across all our schools in Hackney, about what's actually been provided for children, and also how much detail do we know about the digital divide, about Annie's obviously touched on this, that that our awareness that a number of children are struggling with different aspects of the digital divide, but do we have a complete picture, or is our fragmented school system meaning that it's more difficult to have that than might otherwise be desirable? And also, as whatever happens on the 1st of June, probably at least the vast majority of our children are going to continue to be educated away from school by their parents. How much support can Hackney Learning Trust give schools to make sure that there's a consistent level of provision for all children, and to support schools as well as parents and families?
Thank you, Councillor Gordon. Councillor Etty.
Thank you, Chair. I think one of the questions has been covered by Margaret, but what I would just want to know is with regards to children resuming in June. And from what Annie said, with regards to those that will be given the computers, how about children who are not in those categories, and yet whose parents cannot afford those learning resources? How do we get across to such children? Are those children not left behind? And how are we going to, is there no gap in that? Because definitely the materials that will be given by the government will not be able to cover that. And in order to ensure that we reduce the gap in terms of learning, how are we going to know those children? How do we get to know them so that they can continue to have their learning and or study, whichever?
Thank you. Councillor Etty. Councillor Joseph.
Thank you. My question is also about schools potentially resuming on June the 1st. I'm aware that this is going to be left down to individual schools to decide. What I'm just a little bit concerned about is what's going to happen with teachers, individual teachers that perhaps don't feel that they can return safely to the classroom. I mean, we do have a lot of multi-generational families in Hackney. We have a lot of families where potentially teachers are living with key workers who may not feel that they're safe to return to the classroom. And there's been a lot in the media about the NEU, the teachers union, today and previously. And I know that as a council we've issued some fantastic statements trying to support schools and teachers to do what they think is best. But I'm just wondering if the Learning Trust has any plan or any idea about how many teachers might actually sort of rebel against going back on June the 1st, and if so, what contingency planning would there be? Are we going to, rely on mass recruitment of supply teachers? What might happen there? I suppose I'm interested in hearing about. Thanks.
Thank you. Handing over to you, Annie.
Yeah. So I think I'm start with the questions about what's happening at the moment. So each school has a school improvement partner who is in regular touch with the head teacher. So there is absolute support, and there was guidance given very early on to schools about providing for home learning. And I think schools have made a fantastic effort to do that. So I think we have a sort of strong overall picture without having a sort of line by line account for each class in each school. And I think I have heard much about teachers working very hard to make sure they're providing good resources for their pupils. I want to talk a bit about the digital divide. This is an issue for sure. and we know that there is a range there. To provide laptops for every child who doesn't have a suitable one would be hugely expensive. It would be millions of pounds. So I think it's not something the council can take on. What we are doing is running the government scheme very effectively and working with colleagues in other areas of the council, including the ICT team and the communities team and the business team, putting together a strategy which we can start enacting rapidly to do more, to make sure that where we can provide better connectivity, that happens. So there are those things in place, but it is an issue, and it is one that concerns head teachers and teachers. And I think that those children who are disadvantaged in that way, where there is any flexibility about who comes back into school, I know will be a priority for schools. I think the other questions were about schools potentially restarting. So as we know, the government has set an ambition of opening for a number of year groups on the 1st of June, or if you look closely at the wording, it's from the 1st of June, and there are words of flexibility built into the government announcements, and it has clearly become something of an issue to argue about. I think that everybody involved is committed to making sure that children get back safely as soon as possible, and that requires the staff to be safe. There was a question raised earlier about are parents and staff consulted about reopening. Staff are certainly involved in looking at the risk assessment, being well informed of any changes being made to schools, expanding the offer. And remember that 93% of our schools already have children going in through the Key Worker and Vulnerable Children scheme. Parents will be informed about that. I can't quite say that they would be consulted, but I think there would be an opportunity for them to give feedback. And we know that in the first instance, it's not going to be compulsory for parents to send their children back to school. They'll be encouraged to do so. We know that across the piece on feedback we're getting, numbers are around 50% of parents thinking their children will go back to school if that is possible. Some schools it's significantly higher, some schools it's significantly lower. But there will be a lot of individual decisions being made. I think there was also a question about what schools would do in terms of dealing with the anxiety that children might have. And certainly we have given out guidance about that. And again, schools will be well aware that children have had a very turbulent time, and in some cases a time when family members will have been ill, and in the worst case they'll know people who've passed away. Schools will be well aware of that, and both providing general care when children return as well as individual opportunities for counselling. I think there was a question about what happens. A teacher's going to all go back. It's clearly something of an issue. We know that the data tells us that children largely don't get the illness badly, but adults get it more badly, older adults worse, and that there is an issue around the BAME, around BAME colleagues. The head teachers have a risk assessment. There's a significant amount of guidance that's gone into that, and that's also true from national government, although we would like more clarity in a number of areas. Head teachers are in discussions with their staff about all the safety measures being taken. We've been clear that head teachers will take that decision, but they can take it in a way that takes into account factors in their school, the demographic, how many teachers could come back, because some will be shielding, the fact they've got to manage the vulnerable children and key workers children, as well as setting work for children at home. And they'll be working across the piece with their staff, as well as with individuals who might have particular situations, either for themselves or for someone in their family. It's a complex situation and a challenging time for everybody. I think our head teachers are doing great work thinking about the best possible scenario for their communities going back.
Thank you, Annie. Do we have...
Councillor Conway, can I just say a small thing about the digital divide?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. and Councillor Selman may also want to come in on this. I think it's probably worth saying that on the margins, we can't underestimate the work schools will be doing, knowing their vulnerable families that may not be known to us or other services, directly trying to give support that's available. And we know this, for they were out doing, trying to get, people to donate computers, etc. There's a lot of work that goes on. It's not a clean process of knowing this family needs support, this is how I can do it, but schools are very well placed. The council is also trying to do what it can to help families that are perhaps in need but not known to us through a formal process. And I think it's worth maybe Councillor Salmon's talking about the work on that no recourse to public funds, just making a comment about trying to get some money out to the community to help families with things like support.
Yeah, I can come in briefly on that, if that's helpful. Chair?
Yeah, thank you.
So I think, first of all, I guess one thing just to note in terms of digital divide, so I think, it's one of the main topics that comes up in all the conversations I have at the moment around about COVID across the board, not just with young people. And I think we're quite conscious of there's a range of different work streams that need to happen in response to that, as well as in terms of the different challenges that we're seeing. I guess two things I wanted to note. One was round about the thing we're keen to do in the next couple of weeks is to do some working with the voluntary sector as well, in terms of the challenges that they're seeing in relation to digital divide. So, for example, a lot of our organisations who are working with young people, likewise seeing similar issues in terms of their ability to access services and support. So we are keen to co-produce with the voluntary sector what we think we should be putting in place in terms of solutions to that, and how we should be prioritising things, and how we can be collectively working together in a slightly more strategic way around about that. And I guess just on no recourse to public funds, which is what Anne was touching on, I think some of this comes back to some of what Sarah was saying earlier about the existing stuff that we did earlier on round about Section 17 subsistence payments and increasing some of the amounts available for children who are able to access Section 17 support in terms of being children in need, in terms of access to devices. But more broadly, we are also aware of concerns where people perhaps do not qualify, wouldn't meet the threshold of Section 17. So I've been working closely with Councillor Renison in terms of how we can work with local advocacy organisations in terms of developing and using some of the hardship funds to perhaps look at ways that we can use some of that funding potentially to help with a range of things, but including looking at those concerns around about devices, which is something though that is a work in progress that we're developing at the moment with those organisations.
Thank you, Councillor Selman. Can I just, before I bring you in, Councillor Bramble, can I just see how many Commission members have questions that they'd like to ask? Because we're already over time at the moment. There aren't any? Okay, Councillor Bramble.
Thank you, Councillor Conway. I won't labour the point because Annie touched on a lot about schools. What I would say about the digital divide is that the council is looking at that across directorates and working together about mapping the digital divide. And as Councillor Selman has said, working with the voluntary sector. And I would say all cabinet members within their various portfolios think about the stakeholders. We're all thinking about how we pull that piece of work together. It is a challenge, but it is something that the council is looking at and seeking to think about how we respond and address that.
Thank you very much. Sally, do you have a question? And then Councillor Gordon. So Sally, you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I just wanted to go back to some of the SEND issues that were discussed. I understand that obviously OT and speech and language and all the therapists are working very hard, but there's a discrepancy here that I hear a lot about when I talk to parents, because these, for a lot of children, these interventions are being delivered by teachers and speech and teaching assistants in school. They're not delivered by therapists. So many children are going to be missing out on interventions because they would be delivered in school. And I think there is a discrepancy there, and I think a lot of children are missing out. And I thought that's an important issue to raise, because these children will be suffering and their progress is going to be delayed. But thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Councillor Gordon.
And I was going to ask something roughly on the same lines as what Sally has said, but I think I'll slightly readjust my question to, I mean, it's obviously very good to hear about the progress in plans, but there are going to be very significant challenges, both for mainstream and special schools, in reintegrating children with very complex needs. And it would be really good to hear maybe just a little bit more about how that's going to be balanced, particularly in mainstream schools, with the needs of other children, and particularly in children with emotional needs or diagnosis of autism, who will be particularly affected, by the changes during the pandemic.
Thank you, Councillor Gordon. Annie?
Yes, if I say something briefly, and then I might bring Paul in. I think Councillor Woodley wants to comment. Schools are well aware of the challenges facing the children coming back in, and I note the point about some of the things that teachers and teaching assistants would normally deliver just not having been available over the past few weeks. It is a challenge because, for instance, you might have a child with finds it difficult to regulate, who might find it very difficult to socially distance or to stay in one room, which might be being expected more, and to have different regulations. So schools are planning ahead for that. They are talking to the other colleagues who work with those children where necessary. There may be some cases where they'll talk to the parent about a phased return. And I know there are some cases where parents are thinking this is going to be too difficult and ask for my child at this time. So I think we have broad guidance, but I think it needs looking at by the school with the family on an individual basis coming back in. Paul, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, thank you, Annie. The first question with regards to children missing out on access to therapies, I think we recognise that there's been a need for services to speech and language, OT, and other therapy services to use best endeavours and make reasonable adjustments in order to deliver the offer. And so services have been created where possible. Obviously, we're speaking regularly to our parent care forums and various other forums, and in fact, our SENDIAG service, which is our special educational needs, disability information, advice and guidance service, the demand on that service has increased, and they're now working with 75 local families to be able to help navigate their way around our systems where there may be challenges. So the service remains open to taking on comments where there may be a need for challenge and support in that space. But we appreciate that we're asking our professionals to use reasonable adjustments and work creatively and differently in the current time, and to respect social distancing and obviously the context in which we're operating. But in terms of demand and where there may be perceived shortcomings, the information we're receiving is that in the main, and we're receiving positive feedback verbally and in writing with regards to access to our services, the services and the adaptation of the offer seem to have been very well received. But as I said, I mean, we do have a significant number of children and young people in the thousands across the local area are accessing the service. So obviously we'd like to get it right for everybody, but if we are getting it wrong, and if there are gaps in the offer and there's scope for improvement, we do have a number of routes in place that we can actually take that information. In fact, we've got our next meeting with our parent carer forum next week, which will take further advice as well. With regards to children and young people returning back to school with additional and complex needs as we scale up, we have to remember, as Annie said earlier, 93% of local schools have remained open during COVID-19. So for many of those schools, it's not a reopening. In fact, it's a scaling up slightly or an extending of the existing remit. Many of our vulnerable children and young people have been able to access provision. The Garden School, special school, for example, has averaged 27, 28 learners on site in the school, or the most vulnerable. So we recognise that there is a need to scale up and put in place measures, working closely with our schools to minimise the potential for risk. But we're having regular conversations ongoing with our schools and the system leaders and our partners in health and care, again, as I say, to minimise the potential for risk.
Councillor Woodley, did you want to come in briefly? And then I think we'll move on.
I just wanted to comment quickly in response to Councillor Gordon's point, and to really support what Paul is saying with regard to the special schools and the kind of tightrope they've walked, really, in terms of checking the risk assessment for their own setting, for their own staff, for their pupils, both in the setting as they've gradually been able to come in, and at home, and different decisions have been made from setting to setting. So Stormont, for example, although it was open in principle, if there was only going to be one or two or three pupils that come into school, they'd simply say this isn't school. In terms of the adjusting and particularly with our ASD pupils, understanding this change that has occurred through this crisis, I think the head teachers are incredibly sensitive to this, and we're now really encouraging that sort of upscaling and wider opening at a really gradual, really incremental pace, so the teachers and the pupils can make those very adjustments. And I just want to give you an assurance, really, that that has been so carefully considered. And there's also been really pragmatic approaches in terms of risk assessment. So I think somebody referred earlier to the relationship with 47 other boroughs. Each setting has its own risk assessment. We've had DfE guidance on risk assessment, got local authority risk assessment. Really practical decisions have been made about how to kind of prioritise items within those risk assessments. Information sharing across those special schools has been really helpful, I think, and really sensible and efficient decisions have been made. So that was my comment there.
Thank you very much, Councillor Woodley. So I think just because of time, we're going to have to bring that item to a close. Although, and just to thank you all actually for the comprehensive papers and verbal updates that you've given. But given that the COVID-19 discussion items are planned for CYP meetings in June, both in June and July, and quite possibly for CYP meetings going forward, now is probably a good opportunity for us to discuss what the focus for these items should be. Do officers have any suggestions on what the focus for the June 15th meeting could be? Anne or Annie?
I think we'll have a more idea by then about the phased extension of the offer to children and the take up. We'll certainly be able to give verbal reports on that. I think we also will have more to say, and in fact I think the paper might have come round while the meeting's been happening about the strategy about the digital divide, so we could probably report further on that strategy.
So indeed, the paper came round. It's common now for the DfE papers to come round about 8:30 at night. I think it would be worth trying to plan ahead if we can, and it may not be the next meeting, Chair, for sort of provision for the summer break for our young people, and that's kind of upscaling for September. And maybe we could also do a bit about the kind of mental health support for young people that's around, if that would be helpful as well.
Thank you very much. Do Commission members have any suggestions for what the focus of the June 15th meeting ought to be in relation quite specifically to COVID-19? Jo?
I want to reiterate that I think probably there needs to be a big piece of planning around mental health support and across schools, health, social care, and what that, I think there'll be a big need looming.
Yes, agreed. Councillor Peters, Councillor Potter, and then Councillor Joseph.
So I was concerned, as I think most of us are, about the drop-off in referrals around child protection and around that. So I think it would be helpful to revisit that and see if there's been a bulge that has emerged coming out, or whether there is still a long tail of unmet need there.
Thank you, Councillor Peters. Councillor Potter?
Councillor Peters has said exactly what I was going to say. So.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Joseph?
Sorry. I just wondered if there was any opportunity for an email survey for young people, perhaps between now and then, to see how they feel they've coped, and how perhaps how the GCSE year feel that their assessment has been undertaken, and whether or not they think it's been done or is being done in a fair way, and how they feel the level of teaching is. I'm just not sure how. I think someone mentioned earlier how much we actually hear from young people about what's happening to them at the moment, because so much is now out of their control. And also for the GCSE year, it's not only about the exams, but the whole social aspect of that year 11 that's sort of been taken away from them. So I think it would be quite interesting to hear from them.
I think that's a very, very good point you make there, Councillor Joseph. I think it would be really quite important for us to try and find ways of getting some feedback on how this has impacted children and young people. I think from the various different, from young Hackney's engagement with young people to schools I think it feels as though that's perhaps the one thing that's missing from the papers that we've received thus far. So I think it would actually be incredibly useful for us to understand the impact that this is having firsthand on the young people.
Chair, can I just say that let's not forget there's an extensive piece of work that is ongoing all the time with the Young Futures Commission, and they've got engagement activities even next week with young people.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was raving about, Councillor.
So I wonder whether it might even be useful having an update from them at the next meeting.
I think that would be good. The Mayor and I have attended one, and actually I think Councillor Gordon was on that call as well. So there's been dialogue with young people. I arranged a round table today with Youth Parliament and to hear their views, and officers attended that. So I'm sure that the Young Futures Commission would love to give an update, but we can also think about how we're using those avenues to get people and young people's voices heard, because they are anxious and they have concerns. What I heard a lot from young people was them being concerned about the adults that they live with, and if they go out, will they make the adults they live with at risk, which is a real concern for them. So, but yeah, I think that's a really, really good idea.
I think we just had Councillor Etty, Joe, and then we'll have to move on, I think. Councillor Etty?
Thank you, Chair. I think mine has been covered. I would just, in terms of having a discussion with young people, just to hear from domestic violence as well, aspects, its effects on them, and how some of them are coping, and what other supports, what has worked well for them, what has not worked well. And I just want to hear a few of that as well. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Etty. Joe?
Mine was just a little additional one for the educational update. I wonder if we could have a specific update on transitions, primary to secondary, post-16, post-18. It's something that we haven't really touched on, and they're quite crucial moments for young people, and obviously that's all been very disrupted with COVID-19. And I know it would be nice to have an update on plans.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're probably going to have to bring this item to a close now. Thank you again for the papers and for your verbal updates. They've been incredibly useful. Please feel free to leave the meeting, although you're more than welcome to stay. Okay, moving on to item 6, the work programme 2019-20. The work programme from 2019-20 is at page 45 of the agenda pack. A new work programme is in development, and members of the Commission, senior officers and other local stakeholders will be consulted. It is likely that COVID-19 will continue to strongly influence the work programme, not only this commission, but other commissions also in Hackney. And I'll be liaising with other chairs to coordinate and plan the scrutiny of the Council's COVID-19 response and subsequent recovery plans. An outline plan will be prepared for next meeting on June the 15th, 2020. Moving on to item 7, the minutes. The minutes of the meeting held on the 15th of January are attached. A report has been prepared with recommendations from this session, which are being consulted upon before presentation to Cabinet members. Item 8, any other business. Before closing the meeting, I would just like to acknowledge that virtual meetings are still in their infancy, and that the efficacy of our approach to virtual meetings is constantly being reviewed. In this context, I'd like to invite members and officers to feedback on their experience of the meeting so that improvements can be developed where necessary. Does anybody have any feedback? No? Okay. Okay. I'm going to
congratulate you, Councillor Conway. It's been a very successful virtual meeting, and they're not easy. And half of us popped out at one point, but we all managed to come back and contribute. So really well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all. So I'm now going to formally close the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Well done.
Well done. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.